Well, once again, we stand in the book of Acts chapter 7, there with a man on trial for his faith. Stephen, one of the first deacons of the church and also the first martyr, as we'll find. He's been arrested for preaching and teaching about Jesus, a man that very same council had condemned to die. So Stephen is standing in front of the very same men who had condemned Jesus to death. And while Jesus, he spoke very little to his accusers. If you remember, there's a prophecy that like a lamb before its shearers, he would remain silent. And so Jesus spoke very little before those who were about to judge him. Stephen, on the other hand, says, let me tell you a story, and begins to preach to them from the very annals of Jewish history, going back to the book of Genesis. So he makes up for perhaps all that Jesus did not say. In a way, he gives them there was, you could say it this way, on the part of Stephen, his own accusation against them. See, they're accusing him, but he really is turning the tables and saying, no, God is accusing you. Look at the history of your people. You stand right in line in a long legacy of men and women who rejected God's purposes and plans. That you would even reject Moses, and in the same vein rejected Jesus. In the same vein, we're rejecting Stephen. And it is true that the history of the Israelites in the Old Testament, as we've been saying, it's a history of defying the Lord, even when he proved himself over and over again. But it's not just Jewish history. It's human history. It's our history. This testimony of turning our backs to God, even though he has proven himself to us over and over and over again. And if there's anything I could tell you right now, here up front, maybe you don't make it through to the end of the sermon. Today, let me urge you, don't make the mistake of turning away from Christ. I'm fighting with this, and I'm just going to leave it around here. Is that okay? Is that distracting? Either my ear has gotten bigger or something's going on to make that, but I don't want to fight that this whole time. All right. Acts chapter 7, verse 36. After speaking of Moses, whom they rejected, Stephen continues, this man led them out, performing wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. See, when they rejected Moses, they were also rejecting all of these wonders and miracles. And this points us to a fact about rejection, rejecting God, is that we, as a part of our sinful human nature, we can reject even the greatest demonstrations of God's power. That's just a tremendous thought to think about. And recall what the Israelites had seen with Moses. They saw a plague. They saw 10 plagues, one after the other, dominate the Egyptian people. You remember them all, don't you? The blood, the Nile River itself turning to blood, the frogs that seemed to come out of every pot and every vessel, the gnats that flew in, and the flies that covered everything, the livestock getting sick and dying, the boils that covered the bodies of the Egyptians, giving them unceasing pain, a hail and lightning storm that decimated the animals and the land, the plague of locusts, which ate up everything else, the darkness for 3 days that covered the land of Egypt, but not the land of the Israelites. And then lastly, the death of every firstborn thing in Egypt. From each of these plagues, Israel was spared simply by God's grace and protection, except for the last one, where the firstborn were all going to be killed. At that moment, in that plague, Israel was called to sacrifice a single lamb for each household. and spread its blood over the doorposts so that the destroyer would pass over it. And hence, Passover was born. Each of these plagues demonstrated not only God's sovereign power over the natural world, he's the one in charge of the rivers and the storms and our physical bodies and health, the flies, the locusts. He's in charge of the sun, moon, and stars causing the darkness. Not only was he demonstrating his sovereign power over the natural world, he was demonstrating God's supremacy over the so-called gods of Egypt. Each one of these creatures was represented by like an Egyptian deity. And for these creatures to submit, to bow to the God of the Israelites was to say that only the God of the Israelites was really in charge. It was in the face, you could say, of the Egyptians. Not only that, you had just one of the most iconic miracles of the Old Testament, the parting of the Red Sea, where they stood at the banks of this mighty river. And as Pharaoh's chariots were coming down to annihilate them, their backs to the sea, God opens up this passage where it was like heaps of water, walls of water on the left and the right, and the whole of Israel, maybe 6 million, passed through on dry land. That's the part that gets me, is dry land. It wasn't even muddy. It wasn't even sticking to their feet. They're getting their shoes and boots and sandals stuck in the mud. It was dry land. It was a miracle, not just a natural event. And even after the Red Sea, when they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, God provided manna every day from heaven, and quail, and water from the rock, and guidance from a pillar of fire and a cloud, and even clothes that didn't wear out. God provided for them abundantly, you could say, right in front of their face. The wonders and the power of God. It's interesting, in Psalm 105, you have a psalm of praise, and it references all of these events. In fact, if you didn't want to read all the book of Exodus and you just wanted the Cliff Notes version of the Exodus, you just go to Psalm 105. Much shorter, only 45 verses, as opposed to, 40-something chapters. And he speaks of the wonders and the marvel of all that God had did. And it ends on this bright note, you could say, where they're praising him. So verse 34, he brought his people out with joy, his chosen ones with singing, and he gave them the lands of the nations, and they took possession of the fruit of the people's toil, that they might keep his statutes and observe his laws. Praise Yahweh. Hallelujah in Hebrew. But then there's Psalm 106, which comes right after. In Psalm 106, it is like the flip side of the Exodus. Psalm 105 praises God for all that he did and worked. And then Psalm 106, verse 6 is, both we and our fathers have sinned. We have committed iniquity. We have done wickedness. Our fathers, when they were in Egypt, did not consider your wondrous works. They did not remember the abundance of your steadfast love, but rebelled by the sea, at the Red Sea. We think of the opening of the Red Sea as this amazing miracle, and they're walking through and they're praising the Lord. But what does the psalmist say here? Rebellion was still in their hearts. Yet he saved them for his name's sake, that he might make known his mighty power. He rebuked the Red Sea and it became dry. It goes on and on like this, basically saying God did this amazing work, but then they forgot his works. He did this amazing thing, and then they did some terrible thing. He did over and over again abundantly. And they, in turn, despised him, had no faith in him, did not obey him, swore against him, followed after the idols, angered him. On and on it goes. So right after Psalm 105, you have Psalm 106 that kind of tells you that behind the scenes, in the hearts of the people, was this nascent rebellion. and hostility towards God. And he ends Psalm 106 this way, contrasting with Psalm 105. Save us, O Yahweh our God, and gather us from among the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise. Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. And let all the people say, Amen. Praise Yahweh. Hallelujah. There is the unending, unceasing almost demonstration of God's sovereign power in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Jewish history. But likewise, there's this testimony of unfaithfulness to the Lord. Stephen is trying to say to this Jewish council, ask yourself, how could those Israelites reject Moses when they witnessed with their own eyes some of the most amazing demonstrations of God's power? How could they reject him? And that's something they would have to admit. These are scribes and Sadducees and priests. They know what the Hebrew Scriptures say, which certainly describes their faithlessness and their rejection, their frequent rejection. Were they any better? Well, by the same token, how could it be that these men also stood face to face with a prophet greater than Moses? They beheld the Son of God in the flesh, a man who performed miracles, fed 5,000, more than that, tens of thousands, with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He raised the dead, healed the blind, cast out demons. These were undeniable miracles. But beyond that, they hung him on a cross to die and buried him in a tomb. And 3 days later, it was empty. And his disciples were going around with power, preaching the gospel. This same one, they rejected God. Just the same as the Israelites had rejected God. And it's not a Jewish problem. It's a universal human nature problem. We're enamored with spectacle. I've heard sometimes that one of the things that pastors in Africa will request from other nations are fog machines. Fog machines and lights. Why? For the spectacle. Can God use spectacle? Of course. Of course. He can use a donkey talking to a prophet. But shouldn't we be a little humbled that the Israelites had front row seats to some of the most spectacular demonstrations of God's power, and they still rejected him? Sometimes we think that if we saw the Red Sea part in front of us, we would believe in God. Or we think that if God miraculously healed us of some disease, our faith would be stronger. But that's not necessarily true. Human hearts are such that a man could have marveled at the Nile River, turning to blood, and then still go home and beat his wife and kids that night. That's human nature. Spectacle, miracles, wonders, they don't demand faith or cause it. They're only valuable if they point to a holy God who demands my absolute perfection and sinlessness obedience. And if in the realization of that stunning holiness and greatness, I feel small and sinful, and I realize he owes me nothing, and I owe him everything, and I cry out to him to save me and not cast me away, then those miracles have achieved their purpose. Then those wonders have accomplished what they were intended to do. But make no mistake, miracles don't produce faith. What requires faith is knowing you need Jesus. Knowing that you need his forgiveness more than you need him to perform a spectacle. Your atheist friends, your antagonistic neighbor, there's no miracle that will force them to have to believe in Jesus, even though they might claim that. Oh, if God showed up right here in front of my face and did X, Y, Z. No. Faith only comes when there's a conviction of sin, which comes from the Holy Spirit, convicting them concerning sin, righteousness, and judgment, which comes from beholding perhaps something wonderful and spectacular or something very simple. Jonathan Edwards, he was enamored with spiders. It's one of the first things he wrote about. And he's this great American theologian, perhaps the greatest. And yet he could sit there and watch spiders all day. He would see them spin a web, and some of them, what they'll do is they almost make a little parachute for themselves. They spin a web, and they're so light, the wind would pick up these webs that they've spun, and they would seem to fly. And he had to write about it. But that caused him to worship God because he thought, this God who made such a creature as this is the one who owns all the spiders and all the hills and all the mountains and all the stars, and he loves me. And it drew him to worship. He didn't need spectacle. He just needed a few spiders. You're surrounded by that every day. You're surrounded by spectacle every day, if you would but think of it that way. But it doesn't cause us to believe necessarily. Not until you recognize that God is holy and you realize, I should have no right to say anything or be anything or do anything with him. The second thing we see in terms of Stephen's rebuke of this council is that the prophet of God can be rejected. So you got the miracles and the spectacle, but then look at verse 38. 37, this is Moses. This is Moses who said to the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. And this is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai and with our fathers. He received living oracles to give to us. Now, when the whole assembly of Israelites, they left Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea, were led by that pillar of fire at night and the cloud by the day, and they finally arrived to the foot of a mountain called Sinai, or sometimes it's called Horeb. Now, God makes it very obvious that his presence is on this mountain. There's earthquakes, there's lightning and thunder and fire and smoke, and it's just very obvious in terms of spectacle, God is there. And it's there that he tells Moses and the people, listen to me and you will live and you will prosper. And Moses in particular, of course, has been chosen to be the official spokesman for God to the people. He is the prophet, the one who literally was going to communicate the words of God to them. So as far as they were concerned, whatever Moses said was as if God was speaking directly to them. And whatever Moses brought down from that mountain, they were going to be beholden to. And of course, iconically, he comes down with these 2 tablets of stone on which are written the 10 commandments. Now, there's more than that. There's more than 10 commandments that they were going to receive. But these iconic tablets are brought down, etched in stone by the very finger of God. This is who Moses was. He wasn't just a miracle maker. He was a prophet. He wasn't just a prophet. He was the prophet. Deuteronomy 34:10, since there was no one like him. And he stood with God face to face in such a way that it says his face was changed. So when he went to go talk with God, he'd come out and his face would look different. It would practically be glowing. And so they knew just by his even physical appearance that he had been in the presence of God. There was no reason at all to doubt that Moses was God's spokesman and that Moses was speaking directly to them on the behalf of God. And vice versa too. That when Moses spoke to God on the behalf of the people, he was a direct intercessor. Again, he wasn't just the one who spoke to God and who delivered the words of God. He was also the one who received the law, the Torah. This is not just a list of commands, you could say, like morality. This was also the laws that would define Israel as a nation. It was a law book as well as a morality book or an ethics book. It also contained the promises of God and their future. It's prophetic. Moses was bringing all of this to them as he spoke with God on Mount Sinai. And as the mountain trembled and lightning and fire went forth, there was a warning that if any Israelite were to touch that mountain, they would die. And that isn't just about the holiness of God per se, but the holiness of his revelation, of his words, of his law. If you dare break the words of the law, you would be destroyed. Everything about that scene at Sinai made it absolutely clear that Moses, the prophet, needed, whatever he said and brought with him from God needed to be treasured, revered, honored, kept. They could not reject Moses, the prophet, without rejecting God himself. And this Moses said in Deuteronomy 18:18, which is referenced here, that God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. There would be some future day where another man in the power of Moses and in his prophetic ministry speaking as God would come to the Jewish people. And what's the implication that Stephen is making? They rejected the prophet Moses. What would happen to the one that would come after him? Of course, they would reject him as well. It's a long legacy. This is their MO. This is what they do. They reject God. They reject Moses. Sometimes people say that if only God would speak directly, I would believe. Atheists or skeptics, they say something like that. But you know what? It happened over and over and over again in the Bible that God would speak directly to people. And guess what? People still disobeyed him. There's no guarantee that just because a man speaks even from the Lord directly, unquestionably, that you would listen, or that even for men and women to hear directly from God, and somehow that would demand that you would submit and believe. You even had a prophet like Jonah who heard directly from the Lord. He's a prophet. What did he do? He disobeyed. He went the other way. So you're telling me that, but you, for the skeptic, the atheist, if you heard from God, you wouldn't rationalize it away? You wouldn't justify disobeying? Oh, okay, I guess there is a God, but everything I heard about you is that you're a jerk. I'm not going to submit to you anyway. It's folly. We've already seen it played out many, many times. Our sin is what keeps us from submitting to and believing what the prophets have said, not a lack of God's presence. We can see this even in the presumption that because God does not immediately punish disobedience to his word, that must mean he is not there, rather than that he is gracious and patient. See, we think, well, if God is this lawgiver, people are breaking it all the time, the fact that they don't just drop dead when they commit sin, that means God is not there. Think of that presumption. God is not there, rather than thinking God must be very gracious and merciful and patient. That says something about our heart, not about him. I don't want a world where God immediately punishes sinners when we sin. There'd be no one here. Then you don't have churros and In-N-Out and all the good stuff you like, right? No people are here to make that stuff and think of that stuff. This is a much poorer world. So thank God, God is patient with a lot of sinners, because somehow, amazingly, he does good things from it. How easily, then, We would reject God's prophets and his words, just as they did at the time of Moses, just as Stephen's accusers were, and just as we do now. Well, this is just a personal application. Moses was the greatest prophet, but they still rejected him. I mean, he was worried that he lacked eloquence, that he was slow of tongue. That's in Exodus 3. But the unbelief of the people could not be blamed on preaching style or ability. That's not why the Israelites did not believe, because Moses was not eloquent of speech and that he was slow of tongue. I just came back from Shepherd's Conference, and after that, sometimes I will listen to a sermon and think, oh man, I really want to preach that passage now. You got me excited about it. And sometimes I'll listen to a message and think, I would never preach as good as that guy. Just preach that message. And there's something a little bit intimidating, or you get very self-aware sometimes as a preacher when you're around 5,500 other pastors and you talk to them and you share with them and you hear about their experiences, and then you see these great speakers preaching. And I could start to think, I am just nobody. And actually, one of the preachers said that when his daughter was sharing with her teacher that her daddy was preaching at this big pastors' conference, the teacher said, oh, you must be so proud. And she said, no, he's just a nobody. and then he shared, she says that all the time to me, to remind me, and she affirms his calling, she loves him and everything else, right? But she says that so he doesn't think too much of himself, that he's just a nobody. And this helps me out because Moses himself could stand before you this morning and he could turn a staff into a snake in front of your eyes, and some of you would still go home and watch porn in absolute defiance of God's word. Think about that. Moses could do that. He could stand here and do this miracle. We could be at the foot of Mount Sinai and see the mountain. And some people would still see all that and go, if they could, back to their tent and watch porn. How do I know that? Because that's what they did. They built a golden calf and then they cavorted. All right? They did much more than just watching stuff. They did a lot of bad stuff. And in fact, Jesus himself could stand here and preach to you, and after the service, he'd still be out on the patio saying, he went a little long, didn't he? I didn't like the way that he kind of came off judgy. Most people rejected Jesus. Think about that. Most people rejected Jesus. Do you think you're not one of those people? Now, I hope you wouldn't. I hope you wouldn't be one. But statistically, he spoke to hundreds of thousands of people, I'm sure. How many were in the upper room? 120. I'm not telling you to question your salvation or anything like that, but just to be humbled by human hearts, by our own hearts. People rejected Jesus. Now, I'm not Jesus. Why would I ever be surprised if people rejected me? Stephen wasn't surprised. He saw it. He saw human hearts. He saw the history of the Jewish people, and he knew what to expect. Why should you expect any different? If you're a follower of Christ, do you expect to be accepted and beloved everywhere you go? I guess you deserve better than Jesus. I'm not saying there's not seasons, and we are thankful as a nation to have many years of freedom of religion and to have that kind of lifestyle, but realize that's because a bunch of Christians were rejected by the Church of England. The Christian Church of England, they were rejected, and they came here to find freedom of religion and to exercise. Really, by freedom of religion, what they meant was the freedom to exercise a Christianity that wasn't a state Christianity. I don't want to get into the history of that, but it is a very a curious thing that we as Christians have grown accustomed to acceptance. Should be more like the brother they heard about in the video. 10 years toiling and not a single convert. Rejected. How long would you put up with that kind of rejection? 10 years of rejection? Would you still be staying there? Serving, preaching, waiting? Can't even wait 2 minutes for my popcorn in the microwave. I'm not going to wait 10 minutes or 10 years for converts. Most people rejected Jesus. Makes me feel a little bit better about myself, if I'm honest. Maybe I don't need to take myself so seriously. For you, are you rejecting God's clear commands? Clear commands? Don't be surprised. But don't think God is passive or ignorant. If you're sitting here and there's things you know aren't right with you and God, do not presume upon his grace, or you'll find that it's not actually that you are rejecting God, but what you risk is God rejecting you. That's what we see at the end of these verses. Verse 39, our fathers refused to obey him, but thrust him aside. And in their hearts they turned to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make for us gods who will go before us. And as for this Moses, who led us out from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. And they made a calf in those days and offered a sacrifice to the idol and were rejoicing in the works of their hands. But God turned away and gave them over to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. Did you bring to me slain beasts and sacrifices during the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You took up the tent of Moloch and the star of your god Rephan, the images that you made to worship. And I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. Oh, this is a human nature in a nutshell. They reject God and worship the works of their own hands. It is so shocking that the Israelites, while waiting at the foot of this holy mountain, as Moses was literally receiving the commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the likeness of anything in heaven or on earth, that at that very moment, the Israelites were crafting for themselves a golden calf to worship. They refused to obey him, but thrust him aside. This is a parallel in verse 27. If you remember, when the Hebrews were arguing with each other, and Moses says, why are you guys fighting with each other? I just killed an Egyptian for your sakes, and now you guys are fighting with each other. And verse 27 is this, but the man who was wronging his neighbor thrust him, Moses, aside, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? The same word for thrusting Moses aside is used here in verse 39, that the fathers refused to obey him, but thrust him aside. As they did to Moses, so they did to God and himself, and in their hearts, they turned to Egypt. They left Egypt, but Egypt didn't leave them. Egypt was still in their hearts. And there's something very ironic and sad here. Pharaoh saw the miracles of God too. He had a front row seat to the spectacle. And of course, he hardened his heart. And the Lord hardened his heart too. Even when his firstborn son died, he, for a moment, regretted his hard-heartedness. But then, almost immediately, he regretted his regret and sent the chariots after the Israelites. And the irony is that Israel likewise witnessed all the miracles of God. And they also hardened their heart, as Pharaoh did. It wasn't just Pharaoh who rejected God in the Exodus. So did the Israelites. But the real tragedy of these verses is that God turned away. To turn away from God, for a person to turn away from God, it's trite. It's almost cute, like a child throwing a tantrum or a child making a threat to their parents. I'm not afraid of children when they make threats against me. For now, I'm bigger and faster and stronger and have more money than little kids. So there's not a whole lot they can do to me. I'm not scared of kids when they make threats against me. I almost think, go ahead, try it, see what happens. But what changes the temperature, you could say, is when a parent turns away from the child. When a mom stares at a little girl. You know what? I don't want to see her face anymore. Get out of my presence. Leave. All of a sudden, you go from something almost cute, a child trying to reject the parent, to something that would break your heart. Break your heart to see that. If McDonald's or Walmart, and this mother, not even angry, just said, kid, I don't want to see your face anymore. Just get out of my presence. I reject you. That's the bigger deal. And this scene is, turning away from God, that's just a normal Tuesday night for sinners. That's who we are. He does miracles, provides for us, he gives us his word, tells us how to live, and we reject and reject and reject and reject. That's tragic. But the true tragedy is for God to be the one to turn away. And the phrase there, it says, God gave them over in verse 42 to worship the host of heaven. We see it also in Romans 1. It's the judgment of God by letting us get what we want. It's God proving his world and his justice and his measure of right and wrong, that when we want sin so badly, perhaps the greatest judgment God could give is to just let you keep on sinning and see where that leads you. Again, it's self-judgment. In basic training, now when I was in the Army, of course, they love to wake you up in the middle of the night and just make you run up a hill, and they just like messing with you, right? For the smallest infraction, you're going to be doing push-ups, right, or running laps, or have to do the terrible watch shift, right? So they're always messing with you, and you get it, this is about breaking you down and all that stuff. But you know what the worst thing they did to us was, in terms of judgment is kind of the word. The worst thing they did was, there was a day where they said, listen guys, the food truck's gonna come by. And they call them lickies and chewies, which is like candies, snacks, munchies, and pizza, as much as you want. You gotta order it all ahead of time. Now you gotta imagine, we've eaten nothing but chow at the mess hall. And they gave you 2 minutes, you gave a minute and a half to eat it, right? So you don't get to enjoy it, it's not that good anyway, but you're starving. You would talk about food all the time in the barracks and what you miss. You talk about steak and all this stuff, right? And so when they said, you can have candy and pizza, you gotta order ahead of time, these guys are ordering 4 or 5 pizzas, right? And now it's just what you can eat in one sitting. They're ordering 5, 6, 7, power bars and candies and everything. And I remember, that day comes and everyone gets their food and we're just chowing down. And what happens? What happens after? The barracks was just moaning in agony that day. Everyone ate too much. You have people throwing up, right? Judgment, self-inflicted judgment, giving you what you want, letting you suffer from your lack of self-control. Actually, amazing. There's only one guy, tiny guy, and he was like a black hole, his stomach. He took everyone else's pizza and he just ate it. And he had a smile on his face. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. God showed grace, I guess. That guy was amazing. Just tiny guy, and he just packed everything. Everyone else, though, were just like this. And you knew what was going to happen, too. You knew, this is dumb. I'm not going to eat 5 pizzas, but I'm so hungry, and I haven't had anything except this, terrible food. And just think, I will have the self-control. So many aching tummies. So many sick guys. So many guys just laid out, miserable. It didn't taste good. It didn't taste good because you're cramming it down your mouth so fast. That's what it is in just a small, kind of funny way. for God to give people over. He's judging you by just giving you what you want in your sin. What does sin produce? Pain, suffering, shame, destruction, death. All he has to do is just not give you grace. Just let you do what you want to do. When God lets us have what we think we want, we can judge ourselves. The quote from Amos here, Amos 5:26 and 27, it's essentially a rebuke of the Israelite people that when they wandered in the wilderness from Egypt, they not only took provisions for themselves, what did they take? Their idols from Egypt that they learned to worship while they were there in Egypt. They took all their idols too to worship as God is leading them and saving them. They still had to keep around their household idols. And what's interesting about this is Stephen not misquotes, because he's not making a mistake here. But originally in Amos 5:26 and 27, it doesn't say, I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. It says, I will send you into exile beyond Damascus. Well, Damascus and Babylon, they're different places. Why that change? I mean, it's an obvious one. It's not like an unintentional mistake, like these two words are off by a few letters or something. This is deliberate by Stephen. Why does he do that? Again, you got to know a little bit of the Jewish history here, but after Solomon ruled the kingdom, the kingdom split, remember, to the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. There are 10 tribes made up the northern kingdom, 2 tribes made up the southern kingdom, and the northern kingdom was terrible. They're bad. Never had a good king. They always rejected God. Over and over again, God judged them. And it's represented in Damascus, the judgment. Now, the southern kingdom, remember that date, 586 BC? They were judged too eventually, almost 100 years later. They were judged by the Babylonians. But see, they fell into the same pattern. They only resisted the rebellious attitude for a little bit longer than their northern kingdom brothers. So they get exiled to Babylon. So why does Stephen adjust it? He's trying to establish a pattern that you guys have always been a bunch of God rejectors from the time you were even a nation. The Exodus represents the birth of the Israelite people as a nation. From that very moment you were born until you were scattered into exile at the end of the kingdom and the nation, the whole time, bunch of God deniers, bunch of God rejectors. And of course, implicitly, and you're still doing it. You're still doing it. It's what they had always done. They committed the same sin as their forefathers. That same Sanhedrin would have rejected Moses. The same Israelites who fled Egypt would have rejected Jesus. And they did. It's an interesting statement that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 10. Verses 1 through 5, which was, I believe, read this morning. Paul writes to them, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. This Red Sea is talking about the Exodus, talking about the cloud that led them, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Paul is saying that Christ was present in the Exodus in some kind of spiritual way, that in fact, the rock that gave them water, wherever they went, Christ was somehow there. And so when they defied God in the wilderness, rejected the manna and the parting of the Red Sea and the plagues and all those things, they were rejecting Jesus. Just as they were at the time of Stephen's life. And so it was. They rejected God. And you have to, again, imagine that for a moment. People can reject God. Who are you to reject God? Do you think you're so smart? That is so pretty, so talented, so popular that you can afford to reject God, Who do you think you are? Who do you think God is? You can only reject a small God. If there were a small dog in this room right now, you might not know it. Even if you did, you could probably ignore it. But if there was a dinosaur in this room, 3 stories tall, 20 feet wide, you're pressed against the walls because of this gigantic dinosaur that's in the middle of the church, you can't ignore that. You can't really reject the reality of that. It's too obvious. It's too glaring. And the thing is, you can only reject God if you can make him small and insignificant and rejectable. But the thing is, it's the height of our sin and foolishness to try and make the one who's infinite and eternal so rejectable, so small. Do you see how awful and terrible our sin is? That we take the thing that is the biggest thing, if you wanted to kind of put it in terms of size, and you want to make it small enough that you can just throw it in the trash or fit in our little tiny communion cup. Let's put God in there and just toss him like we do on Communion Sundays. It's the height of our sin. Do you see how that says something about our sin that we would try to, if there were a dinosaur in this room right now, and you were to tell me, no, there's no dinosaur that's 3 stories tall, 20 feet wide, I would say, what's wrong with you? There's something not cogitating. How could you reject that? You'd say it's folly. You'd get frustrated. You almost say, this is morally wrong that you're rejecting that there's a dinosaur in the middle of this room right now. How much worse is it that we as sinners reject God? It's so blinding, so corrupting, so distracting, our sin. The Israelites saw miracles that painted a picture of God as being glorious and mighty, powerful, over all of nature and the creation, the whole mountains shaking, the prophet of God carrying these tablets written by the very hand of God. And they still rejected him? That says something about us, not about him. If we can see these things, witness these things, if they could and we could, still find a way to make God small and rejectable, what can we do? I'll be honest, I don't know sometimes. How can I solve that? If people could be that sinful, if I could be that sinful, I think there's no silver bullet for the answer here. I don't think what I need to do more is more spectacle. I don't think what I need to do more is preach better. I think what I was hearing a lot at this conference is I need to pray more for you guys, let alone myself. But if I were just to try and leave something here at the end, is to say something like this. I was wrestling with this, even up until this morning. I mean, what am I trying to say to people? If you can reject God, if you're the kind of people that can reject God, how am I going to change that? What can I do about that? And maybe just to try and, if God would be gracious enough, just say something that might help. And one thought that I had that was, again, echoed even at the conference, it's not that right now what you need is that you need Jesus. What I mean by that, everybody needs Jesus. Right? Everybody needs Jesus. Like you need oxygen to breathe. Like everybody knows you need oxygen to live. What you need, though, is you need to need Jesus. You need to know you need Jesus. It's one thing to say, I know I need oxygen to live, and just sort of take that for granted. And it's another to say, if you're trapped in a car that had, that was rapidly filling, with carbon monoxide to say, I'm going to die if I don't get oxygen, then you're very aware that you need to breathe. This morning, you know you need to need Jesus. You need to know you need Jesus. And I think one of the ways that we know we need Jesus is to realize we're sinners. How important the cross of Christ is directly proportional to how you think your sin really matters. If you think sin is not a big deal in your life, then when Jesus dies for your sin, it's like, oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Like someone lending you $20 when you ask for it. But if your sin is what's causing you to reject God, and you cannot reconcile yourself to him because of this sin, when you see the cross, you start to realize, what did you do, God? Why would you do that for me? I don't deserve that at all. Why would you forgive even one of my sins, let alone my whole life of sin? Now it's something more meaningful. Now it's something that matters. You need to know you need Jesus. You need Jesus. For sure, everybody does. Just like you need to breathe. But do you know you need Jesus? This morning, right now, where are you? Are you rejecting Jesus? It's to reject life itself and hope and forgiveness and glory. To do what? To try and get life and hope and forgiveness and glory yourself? How's that been working out for you? It all pales in comparison to what Christ is. Not just what he brings, but who he is. If you don't know Jesus this morning, talk to me about what that means, or Bing, or Andy, or anyone here who looks like they are aware of their sin and their need for Jesus. And we'd love to tell you more about him. If this morning you are a believer, I hope things are going well with you. But if you're like me, there's just seasons and times you just feel like things are not going well. Hit a plateau or get frustrated by things. Do you know? Do you remember that you need Jesus? It makes things so much simpler. Oh yeah, all I need is Jesus. All this other stuff, it's okay. Nice to have. Nice if that works out. I have Jesus. I need nothing else. Remember that. Remember, don't be as the Israelites were. God has promised that all who cry out, call out to him, he will hear. Cry out to him, he will hear you.